Pastor AJ Hausman, and welcome to Shit They Don't Tell You on Sunday, a podcast to dig deeper into aspects of the Bible that get glossed over or totally ignored in most preaching. The Bible has a lot of parts that are racy, uncomfortable, and sometimes downright horrifying. Let's talk about it. Welcome to episode 21. Our lovely guest today is Vicar Taylor Berdahl, who is a seminary graduate. He's now official Master of Divinity. Woo! And is what I like to call a free agent in the church right now. For the Lutherans, all that means is she's awaiting call. Yeah. And hopefully will be a called ordained pastor here real soon.
Eventually. Yeah. We'll get there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But right now, she has all this free time to just premiere on podcasts.
Exactly.
And things like that. So
it's my truest honor, and it's a lot of fun to be here. So
yeah. So today we're going to talk about the gospel reading for Sunday, August 29th. I hope that you have enjoyed our mini-series that we did the last few weeks, where we didn't talk about the lectionary, the specific Bible readings, but talked about broad theological views and concepts and things. Hope it was good for you. It was good for me. I really enjoyed it. And we saved you all 5 weeks of talking about bread.
I could talk about bread for 5 weeks straight, but not necessarily in the scriptural sense.
Jesus carb loading. I don't think I was not into it. I didn't even preach about it at all. I was just 5 weeks of bread. Nope, I'm out.
I'm good.
I use it as a really good excuse. I was like, we're gonna do an Ephesians sermon series.
Yes.
Which is great. You should do that every once in a while. I think also sometimes pastors can get stuck with just preaching the gospel week after week after week. And I think when you do that, two things happen. One, it gets just you get drained, right? Yeah. And then two, this may sound terrible, but people might get tired of hearing about Jesus, right? There's so much else that's happening. There are 66 books in this Bible, you see, and we only talk about 4 of them.
Not to get, super down and dirty with it, but we do call ourselves triune,
right.
Christians, right?
Yeah.
So we should be talking about God's witness throughout the rest of Scripture and history too.
Yep.
I don't know.
We sure should.
Just my thing.
Mm-hmm. We're not going to do that today, though. We're going to talk about.
We're only talking about Jesus today, so not today.
Next time, maybe. Okay. Today we're going to talk about the gospel lesson for Sunday, August 29th. I already said that. Good stuff. It's super uncomfortable, so get excited for this topic. It is Mark chapter 7, verses 1 to 8, 14 to 15, 21 to 23. I may not even say it again. The audience knows exactly how I feel about that. Actually less bad in this one than I do in most of them because, I feel like what was left out was something that just confused. Jesus goes off on a tangent and then comes back to his main point, and I think just confused everyone. And so whoever was putting this together was let's just leave that out. I think it's just gonna confuse everyone.
I'll just skip that one.
Yep. And then one verse, verse 16, which is a detested verse. Not detested.
Yeah, contested.
Thank you. That's the word I was
close enough.
I detest this verse.
I detest it.
I don't actually. It's a very fine. It's a
repeat.
Simple sentence, but
probably scribal error.
Yeah. But some people say that sentence was there, and some people don't.
So
that's all that means.
We're just skipping it.
So we're just we'll just skip it.
Yep.
Great. Okay. Do you want to read it? Or do you want me to read?
No, go for it.
Okay. Now, when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who have come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders. And they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it. And there are also many other traditions that they observe. The washing of cups, pots, and bronze kettles. So, what if it's never mind. I was going to say, what if it's a pewter kettle? Okay. So the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" And Jesus said to them, "Isaiah prophesies rightly about you hypocrites, as it is written, 'The people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrine.'" I have to leave my comments for the end, and that's the problem when I read this sometimes. "You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition." Then Jesus called the crowd again and said to them, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come: fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person." This is the gospel of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Woo! Like I said, there's a lot going on in this, and a lot of first of all, Taylor would like to make one joke about what comes out of a person is what defiles them.
I don't know how to make the clever sexual joke, but come on, there's been years and years of people telling you that if you receive something into your body, that's wrong, but sounds like the what comes out is more the problem.
I thought you were gonna make a poop joke.
Oh well, there's also poop in there. That's the part that's cut out.
Left out versus
Jesus
poop?
Jesus talks about a sewer, which is amazing.
Yeah, he does.
Yeah. Let's see. It's in this section. He says, "Don't you see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile, since it enters not the heart but the stomach and goes out into the sewer?"
Yep, there's your poop joke. Maybe that's why they left that out, because people would then just start talking about poop.
Yeah.
And miss the main
Miss
point
the rest of the.
what's
This
going
happened to
on
me in
there.
Sunday school one time. It was Advent, so asked the kids what are you waiting for? Has there been a moment where you just sat and waited and were super hopeful? And this kid was like, "One time it took me a really long time for a poop to come out." But I just went with it. Hey, pray on the toilet. That's fine.
Listen,
Look,
yeah.
Patience is patience.
Actually, there are people. I do know people that that's.
Yeah.
They do. That's prayer time for them. They're just
It's unadulterated alone time.
Yeah.
No one can interrupt you, by definition.
I mean, they can, but it's
Wow.
really rude. Come on, even.
Everyone suffers.
I feel you hear a lot of parents saying that at some point in time. They're like, "I just want to sit on the toilet. It's the only alone time I get."
Yeah. With social media, it's dangerous. I feel like I just scroll and scroll.
Yes, yes, there's that. So your legs fall asleep and you're like,
right.
"Well, I guess
that's how I know."
Okay, good. Poop joke out of the way. So this Jesus is talking a lot about. We talk about these Jewish purity laws.
Yeah.
Which we got an entire book of them. It's called Leviticus. An entire book of these purity laws, and there's different kinds. They have family purity laws, a lot of stuff about blood. They really don't like blood. Food purity stuff, which is kind of the stuff we're seeing here, and then temple purity, which has some overlap but is a little different. So they got a lot of rules, right? So these purity laws of what makes a person clean or unclean. And you're not supposed to do holy things when you're unclean.
Yeah.
And things can't be unclean.
And I think one of the things that we miss about that too, removed from the history of it, is that it wasn't necessarily you were labeled one or the other forever and ever. There were rituals made to sort of enable you to move through life in these ways that respected some of the separation. But at the same time, just like today, people could get really caught up in some of it, and there was stuff that went really far.
Yeah. And that that's a good point too. That to recognize that then a lot of the rituals within the Jewish tradition have to do with that crossing between being unclean to clean in the various different ways.
Yeah. And sometimes, I don't know, have you ever read the Anita Dormant book, The Red Tent?
No, but I know the book.
It's like this kind of historical fiction, sort of like biblical setting of whatever, about, what women did in the tribe of Israel, when they were all menstruating, which is a time when you're considered unclean.
Yep.
But you, for the women, they understood it in the way she imagines the story, to be like a wonderful celebratory time where you are mandated to rest, and you get to stay in this tent and just gab, and someone else is doing all your chores for a week, and it's a great time. And so I think, there are some things that, we can look back and go that's so archaic, but there's some stuff that was I wouldn't mind a break every once in a while.
I was gonna say, I'm listen, if there's a positive spin that you can put onto menstruating every week, listen, I just get a break for 7 days. I don't have to do anything.
I can't touch anything anyways. It's fine.
Yeah, that would be maybe great.
Maybe. I don't know.
And there's the other perspective of basically feeling like an outcast
right,
for 7 days a month and being separated from your family.
Yeah.
And then we talked about the bleeding woman, right? So she was bleeding for 12 years, and I don't.
That's too long.
That's too long.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it could get extreme. Anyway, so these Jewish purity laws. So they're in the Bible, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why don't we follow these anymore? Does anyone wonder that when we ever read about them and we're like, oh,
yeah,
those are a lot of rules there.
I mean,
and that Christians just don't care about them.
One of the ones Jesus references is if you disrespect your parents, you can just kill the kids. That would not be okay these days.
No, it's
definitely not considered Christian. There's a lot in there that's super obscure, super extreme. Yeah.
So to get really Lutheran, Martin Luther always talks about that you have to view everything, all the laws, everything, in light of the gospel. That is because of the good news of Jesus Christ, who came, taught us things, showed us the new way, and then died to forgive our sins to fulfill the law. That everything's different now. That this is the new creation. That we are new creatures. And so because of this, we now have to then rethink all of these things. And so he made a really big point about rethinking all of the 10 Commandments, but mostly didn't really touch the entire book of Leviticus and purity laws.
Mm-hmm. It's just a lot to read.
Yeah, it is. There's a lot to take in there. So a good thing that I heard to describe this is that the lawmaker, so God, became the lawkeeper, became then incarnate in Jesus Christ, and died for the lawbreakers, all of us. So the lawmaker became the lawkeeper who died for the lawbreakers. That might be a super simplistic way to kind of look at that, and definitely very much follows that basic atonement theory, but it does kind of get to that main point.
Yeah.
Because the whole thing is when they then, started the Christian church, right? They made a lot of changes, right? Paul was even listen, you don't have to become Jewish first to be a part of this. It's not about that. It's about something else because Jesus took care of these. So in Matthew chapter 5, verses 17, do not think that I have come to abolish the law of the prophets, Jesus announces. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. To fulfill them. That within Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, he has fulfilled all of the law for us, and therefore releases us. Because the whole concept, of course, we suck, we're sinners, we're imperfect, we're all of these things, we can't do this. And so God had to come and take care of it for us, right? That was impossible.
And I also feel it's part of it is we are incapable of keeping the law as the broken humans that we are. And also the lawmaker and the lawkeeper are one and the same God. And one of the things that we're incapable of doing is understanding the intent that God has for creation.
Completely. For sure.
And that's where the law kind of points us towards, but again is still not as any more exhaustive than how to fix an iMac for Dummies that was published in '98 would be today. That's not gonna do it for us, right?
First of all, the iMac for Dummies from here. That's probably the title of this episode.
Yeah.
But that idea of like what that we don't understand and we can't fully comprehend what is God's intention for creation. And so then we take these things that are written down and we like go nuts with them.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's really what humans are the best at, of like taking things extreme, taking them out of their context, and using them if and when and how we choose.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that can become, problematic theology. Yeah. And just that we don't know what God's intentions are. I really like that. Thanks. Sometimes I think about that and I go, what was the point?
Yeah. I think about it a lot. Yeah. And
I'm trying to figure it out. I don't know what the point is. But that's the thing is like we don't know what the intentions are. Yeah. I really like that.
Oh, thanks.
That's super good. That's probably going to actually make it into my sermon.
Great.
If I
happy to help.
To come back to the gospel.
Yeah. Well. Sometimes you got to talk about Jesus in church.
But anyways, what I think like also can in this passage then what Jesus addresses and what we talk about with this idea of clean and unclean is we have a modern system of purity culture.
Yep. Yeah. It's pretty pervasive. It's and I think it's just in the same way that Jesus is like coming up against, the religious leaders of his day saying like, you've got this wrong, like you're taking it too far. This is not exactly, this is not the important stuff, is the actual like cleaning of the hand. There's so much more depth to all of it. Yeah. I think in a lot of the same ways, we, maybe not us exactly, but people who came before us have like really bastardized a lot of what we find in our own religious tradition, and certainly in, some of the parts of religious tradition that we've inherited from our Jewish siblings and things like that too. And there's so much going on today that just is everywhere, and of course like I grew up in Texas for most of my life, and right now schools aren't allowed to mandate masks being worn in schools. And one of the things a lot of people are posting are like, well, you sure did a great job of mandating spaghetti straps, like we weren't and just walking around. And it's whether you're in an official religious setting or not, I think it's all over the place. It's in diet culture in places too that we start to think about all foods labeled as either good or bad, right. Good for you, bad for you, healthy, unhealthy, all those things. And there's a lack of depth to kind of understanding all these.
It makes it very simplistic, right? Like it's either one, it's black and white. Yeah. We get in that black and white problem where it's either one or the other, but there's never an in between.
Yep.
So so the thing with like the like modern day purity movement that we have, at least mostly around sex, because that's the thing people want to regulate more than anything else that you're ever going to do in your life. Mm-hmm. We're obsessed with regulating people's sex lives. Yeah. 100%. And so is the church. Mm-hmm. Always has been. Well, that's not true, actually. It's been for a long time, though. It hasn't always been, but it has been for a long time. Which is something, I think one of our guests has said this at one point in time, that it's crazy that this is what we want to regulate. I think it might have been Chris. That this is what we want to regulate when, like, Jesus never talked about sex.
Right, yeah.
But these are the things that we get really, like, fixated on when it comes to Christian morals. Okay, so the social purity movement that started in like the late 19th century, about the same time as the temperance movement, when they were, because you have to regulate alcohol and sex together, right? Mm-hmm. Like those have to, obviously.
Tequila makes your clothes fall off. I
mean, and so the intent at the time was, to protect women from rape, from male predators, other situations, from like being sold into prostitution, so human trafficking. And then it kind of got a little expounded from there, and then they started to want to regulate abortion, contraception type deals, and then they were just like, listen, new plan, just tell everybody not to have sex until they get married.
Because no violence can happen once you are married, right?
Exactly. Well, so this was the thing too, is around that same time is when they started to change the laws of consent, because the consent age consent, right? Those are my air quotes for the listeners. Consent was at age 10.
Oh my God.
And then they moved it to 16, so that's a good.
Wow.
It's a good jump there. And then also like legal marriage laws also started to change. They're like, oh, maybe we should stop marrying off children.
Yeah. Seems like a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, also people live longer, so it wasn't really necessary to marry off children anymore.
Dark. I like it. Yeah.
Right. But so then these things sort of took on this face value and took the idea that like they were representative of Christian moral values. And so then, you have your feminist movements and things like that were like the opposite, that those were the ungodly people, blah, 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 but that like Christian virtue.
Yeah.
Which is alive and well, and we see that in a lot of conservative evangelical Christianity today, which is where you get some of those platforms, was it Protect the Family or what?
Sure. Sounds right.
Something like that. There's a few of those. And if you want to learn more about those and the rise of sort of what we now can call Christian nationalism and how those things got tangled together, I encourage you to go back and listen to our podcast about that with Jack Jenkins, who is kind of an expert on the topic. So you should go back and listen about that stuff. But it kind of expanded, and then we got this like radical purity culture, and like mostly then a century later in like the 80s and 90s. So in our lifetimes, where you got the what was it, the purity rings where you like make a promise to Jesus that you're gonna be.
No. Well, first your dad takes you on a date. And, do you not? Did this
no,
not?
No. We didn't have anything like this. All I know is like other people's stories, and then like when I read about it. So tell me.
This didn't happen to me. Like my dad is awesome.
No, but you live in Texas.
I grew up near enough to the Bible Belt that this was a common occurrence. That like when you got maybe around the time you started your period. Honestly, I don't know, but like at some point,
that's what I wanted.
Right.
After I started my period, my dad did take me out on a date. And talk about it. My goodness.
Your dad takes you on a date because obviously, like, he will be the most important man in your life until you inevitably, fall in love with a man and then end up, giving yourself to him instead, which is not weird at all. And your dad gives you this purity ring that signifies your promise to Jesus not to have sex until you have a wedding ring on that finger.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. It's doesn't make sense to me, but it's okay.
I'm
not sure at what point like you as the 13-year-old girl like are making a decision about this, right? Like your dad's like, I made this promise for you.
Well, you're not really making a decision about it. I mean, I just think about like how we've then like talked about sex. Like you're just not like, it's just in even schools like they're preaching abstinence. Like absolutely don't do this.
Yeah. And
then it gets. And you get into some of those more conservative places in like the Bible Belt where they don't even teach you about sex in school.
Yeah.
And then from there, that actually just like causes a bunch of problems because then you just have a bunch of people that aren't educated about what's going on. So then you have, STDs are running rampant. Then you do actually have more of, I think more of a teenage pregnancy problem in most places. And it's like, if we just talked about these things.
Yeah. Well, and two, I think there's lots of well-intentioned people who never learn because it's abstinence-only education, you never learn about, like, certainly contraceptive, strategies and things like that, but also you don't learn about, like, the basics of consent because it's just assumed that your consent is, like, what you say at the altar right before you get married and that's it,
Yeah.
And so, like, I think there can then be sort of, like, maybe well-intentioned instances all over the place where that gets violated over and over again, and mostly to the detriment of women, but certainly to the detriment of all genders too. And it's I think really heartbreaking.
You see that a lot in like situations. I think where women don't feel like they have consent. That like they're literally told their husband has that right over them. The whole time.
Well, and two, I think unmarried people across the board, if you don't know anything about sex at all, you don't know like which steps along the way, are okay or not okay. Are you allowed to say no to a kiss on the cheek? Are you allowed to say no to holding hands? Like whatever it is. And so you end up with a lot of situations where maybe you're not actually, crossing coitus or whatever, but you are put in situations. People are put in situations where they, are doing things they don't understand, maybe don't want, maybe they do want, maybe they're confused about the, and so I just think across the board it leads to a lot of unhealthy stuff that ultimately damages people all over the place,
Yeah. Yeah, and then so that's also then, you have the stuff you're talking about, the binary stuff of what's good,
right,
what's bad, what's this,
Mm-hmm.
and how those cross borders of not just about sex, right, that we then...
Yeah. Because you end up with all this stuff that's like, somebody either is like sex thirsty, sex crazed, that's all they want out of you, and that's the if somebody wants sex from you, then that must be their defining like personality trait, right? There can't be anything else complicated about them. And so that becomes who they are, and you have to just avoid that type of person rather than have a conversation with each other about your boundaries and what you do or don't want, all that kind of stuff. And
that idea that like both people are consenting adults
right.
that can have like opinions and limits and like what's comfortable and what's not comfortable.
Instead, you get a lot of like heteronormative sort of like girls, like guys are always going to want sex from you, and it's your job to just like keep them at bay until it's right, and the only time it will ever be right is like once you're married,
Okay, so
that's terrifying.
There's a question for me. So a lot of what we have with like the purity culture, as well as like the purity movement that happened 100 some years ago, it was all focused on like women and women's virtues, and like women then would be damaged goods if you did have sex before you got married, that somehow your ability to receive God's gift of grace and sanctification depended on you being a virgin until you got married.
Yeah. I mean, the metaphor is almost like dough that you have in the freezer, that if you defrost it before you're ready to cook it, like will never make good bread, right? Like
I have never heard this metaphor before. I don't really like make dough and then freeze it though.
But just that there's no like it's not, and sex is not a part of who you are. Your sexuality is not a part of yourself. It is something separate. It's something you have to like protect, share, maybe give, maybe keep,
But that we're like also taught that it's like inherently bad.
Right. Yeah. And once that's been, touched, taken out of the freezer, you're done. Yeah.
So my question is then like, what then through this process are boys taught? What are men taught in this same process?
I think they're taught that they're monsters. I think that they're taught that if they want sex, then that they are, they're a villain until it's in an appropriate setting, and then all of a sudden you're supposed to think of yourself as good for having desire, right? And also taught that they have all the power, that they get to decide or they don't, and I think
well, but I think also you're right, like taught that in a negative way of sort of like you do have all the power, and so like you need to use it the right way. And, like you're not allowed to use it.
Yeah.
But there is not the same shame around teenage boys having sex than there is girls. And I even remember that in high school, like those were the sluts, right? Like those are the...
Yeah, and I think that's where the purity culture comes in, right? You're either defiled or you're not, which is, how this connects so closely to the text is that like...
And remember what we learned about.
If something has come into you, then you're defiled, is the narrative that you hear.
There's no like, you're not permanently defiled in Jewish purity laws.
Exactly, and this is where it is like a bastardization of what...
It's all a bastardization.
There's no way to pinpoint it. Yeah. And it's just I think
Catholic Christians misuse scripture one more time.
And I think that's where so much of the
appropriated, I think, is the best word.
Yeah.
We're really great at appropriating Jewish, like not just Jewish laws, but sort of like Jewish traditions in a way that makes them fit to what we want the message to be as Christians. And so that's why, first of all, that's why it's important to like talk about some of these things that like you need to put them in their context, right? Because this isn't what this is about. They're not talking to you. Like this is a very different scenario, but then also like how we as Christians then take them and make them what we want them to be.
Yeah. And then all of a sudden, this isn't just about like whether or not you are considered desirable societally, or if you're going to be marriageable, or any of those things. It's also about whether or not you're getting to heaven or you're going to be sent to hell, you know. And that, I don't think at any point my understanding of God matches up with that, you know, and so that's what's really damaging.
Right, and so that's, I think, that's something that, like, is that every person, I think, that has experienced this kind of theology thrown at them that really needs to wrestle with, like, because I bet you there's a good chunk of people that are hearing this that, like, part of that could be why they don't go to church anymore, right? Like, they told me some horrible shit and that I was wrong and damaged goods and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, I wouldn't go to that church either. I mean, like, because again, like, your experience of a loving God and this message of, like, no matter who you are, no matter what's happened to you, no matter where you come from, like, you are still a beloved child of God who has been given the same gift of grace as everyone else. And so for you then as a church to turn around and be like, oh, but you're damaged goods. It doesn't. No. It doesn't make any sense.
And it's, anyways, we can talk about it forever, but I think...
we could talk about it forever.
I think it leaves people with a very limited understanding of humanity, a very limited understanding of God, and it kind of messes us up.
So a person is unclean.
Yeah.
Then they would go through a ritualistic process to then become clean. Like at the end of every period, a woman would go through a certain like ritual. Like we have, so like the same thing with all the purity laws. There's a thing then like you would go through a ritual to be unclean. Like it wasn't just washing their hands, right? Like it is a whole, it's a thing, right? And so this idea that like Jesus came to fulfill the law, all of those things that we would have to individually ritualize ourselves to become clean. Jesus did that for us, right? Like Jesus fulfilled that ritualistic nature to make us clean.
And I physically, I think about it in the sense of the water. I mean, as our baptismal theology shapes so much of what we do as Lutherans and stuff. But like we are not just swimming in the waters of baptism that temporarily cleanse us from whatever impurities or sins that we've kind of accrued. We're swimming in the same baptismal waters as Christ, who's completely pure, if you want to use this sort of framework, and we are eternally clean, eternally pure because of Christ, not because of anything we've done, but just because of the waters of baptism. And so it's not even a question, but we still have to figure out how to live our lives. We still have to treat each other excellently. We still need to do those things because that's what God wants, and that's what God wants for us. It's not to earn anything.
Well, and I think that
do you have something to say about that?
Our next piece of item here. So Jesus says, the things that come out is what defiles you, right? And so I think that's more has to do within our relationship with others. What we are constantly called into is in our relationships with one another. So Jesus took care of the hard work. Our job is to live in response to this gift and to uplift one another in community. Like it's all about the whole humanity. It's never individual. It is the cosmos, the lifting us up together. And so how do we live in that relationship, right? So Jesus says, here are some things maybe don't do. That these are the things that damage relationships with others, right? Every single one of these is about damaging relationships with others, and those are the things, that cause problems. So I have fornication, porneia.
That's the Greek.
The porneia Greek. Yep. So this is where we get porn, right? Like, and the idea that like this is a thing that like takes advantage of a more vulnerable person, right? Theft. Clope, where we get kleptomania.
This is just a vocabulary lesson, actually.
It's really fun though. Murder, that one I don't need to explain. There's no other way to define that one. Adultery, avarice, which is a fun word that you don't see very often. The Greek word is pleonexia, which is the word for covet. So in the laws that we get, like don't covet your neighbor's stuff, don't covet, that's that word. That's coveting.
Which to me, like I wouldn't translate that as avarice in English. Avarice to me is more like looking at your neighbor across the street and wishing a tree would fall on them or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, it's not, it's more just, but that, whatever.
I mean, like, so with that jealousy concept. Right?
Yeah. Wishing ill upon someone else, and maybe wanting to benefit from them.
Yeah. Wickedness, poneria, which is like malice. This is iniquities. Anywhere you get that in the Bible, some places just translated as sins. So the idea is that the wickedness is the bad thing. That there are two. You can either righteousness and wickedness. That they're opposites. These are the biblical dichotomy. Is you want to be righteous, you don't want to be wicked. And so that's an old. You see that all throughout the Hebrew scriptures as well. Like, we want to be righteous, we don't want to be this. And the righteousness, which is diakos. I'm going to screw it up. There's an N.
Dikaios.
Oh, that's, yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I always put the infinitives on there, and just because it makes it, okay.
You nerd.
Yes. Which is to be justice,
Yeah.
You know, the not guilty, the innocent. So, like, these are always the opposites. So you don't want to be wicked, malicious. You want to be just in justice.
And I think they're both verbs too, right? Like, you're not either stamped one or the other, right? You're living in wickedness, you're living in righteousness. Like, it's all of these things, you know.
Yeah.
It's how you live.
Deceit, that one's the same. Licentiousness. How often do you hear this word in your day-to-day lives?
In church only.
Which is selgia. Which is like an outrageous behavior. This was my favorite definition from the Greek lexicon. Conduct shocking to public decency.
Oh my.
Most of the time we apply it to sex. Doesn't necessarily mean that. It's just like when you often hear about it and anybody ever talks about it in church, they're talking about sex.
Every time I hear licentiousness, I'm now only going to think of Barney Stinson peeing outside and getting fined.
That's exactly it.
Public indecency, that's it.
Yes. Conduct shocking to public decency. Okay. Envy in our translation, which is actually, it's actually a sentence, which is ophthalmos, which is an eye, or a mind's eye, like your mind's eye. And poneros, which is the same as poneria, we talked about earlier, this wickedness. So your mind's eye, wickedness.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
I say that most mornings. Cleanse me from mind's eye wickedness, oh Lord.
Well, so I don't know. I don't hear envy in this at all. Yeah. I don't know. But some translations will say an evil eye.
Yeah.
Which I'm just like.
Which is like all over, all kinds of ancient religions like have different versions of that. So I think that's like definitely beyond our context, you know, and understanding.
How I would define it is malicious intent.
Yeah.
You know, that you are thinking about doing something wicked. You're wicked, and so like in the concept of like relationships, right? Like it would be a malicious intent to hurt someone, to do something else. Slander, blasphemia, pretty standard.
Heard of that one?
Yeah, heard that word before. Pride, which is pride or arrogance, and then folly, which is foolishness or a lack of perspective. Is what that Greek word is.
Man, that gets us all the time, right? Lack of perspective.
Lack of perspective. No, but that is like a really like, that could preach right there in and of itself is like, what is this lack of perspective?
Yeah.
And I actually think that it's, to me, like, is maybe it poignant that Jesus ends his speech with that. Mic drop is like, and you have a lack of perspective.
Yeah. Goodbye, I'm gonna go heal some more people now.
Yeah. I mean, but like, that's just him calling them out all the time, right? Like when they're trying to come at him and he's like, it's all, I don't know. It's all about perspective. I mean, that's what lack of perspective is.
And, you know, perspective and even thoughtfulness too about the people around you, right? You know, like how often do we hurt people because we never thought about how they might receive something, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think what's so, I just think about often lately, I've been thinking a lot about how hard it must be to be a human at all, but especially to be like coming of age right now, and being surrounded by so many examples of of disregard for the people we live around, you know.
Right, yeah.
There's so many adults in the world who are so so obviously just mostly interested in their own interests and sometimes their own purity, you know. And I think a lot of times it comes out of a place of this desire to be good, and that isn't in itself a bad thing. But if that's our only purpose, if we're Pharisees who only care about washing our hands before we eat and not about feeding the people who are hungry, you know, if we are only worried about the possible, you know, side effects of a vaccine, perhaps that we aren't sure about, but can't see past our own faces that there are people who need protection, you know, from a herd immunity kind of thing, that is contrary to how God wants us to live in relationship with one another.
Yeah. The lack of perspective and the fact that, like, again, the idea is that we're already saved.
Yeah.
And that it's about our relationships with one another.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the perspective, like, to me, like, that's when I think about, like, what is a Christian morals to me. It's not about who you're having sex with and what you're doing here and, like, maybe you smoke, maybe you drink, you didn't get into that temperance movement thing. You know, like, that's my thing about Christian morals is sort of like, what are you doing for those around you? What are you doing to live righteous, to aim for justice, to uplift those around you, to, you know, do the things that Jesus asked, like serving the sick, the poor, and the orphan. Like, you know, if we want to talk about what a Christian morality is, to me, that's...
Yeah. And I think too, respecting the dignity of the people in your life, whatever it is you're engaging in, right? You know, like if you're taking a smoke break and you're rude to everyone who walks by you and tries to say hello, you know, to me, like the problem there is the way that you're treating passersby, not necessarily what you are or not putting in your body. You know, that's between you and your doctor, right? And all these other things.
Again, it's not what you put in.
Exactly. It's what's coming out, you know, and I think that's you see this all over the place, that Jesus wants us to care for one another and see the goodness of God in our fellow creatures. You know, it's a hard task. I'm not saying it's easy, but I think that's what God wants from us.
I agree. Nailed it. Now that's the mic drop situation. And for those of you who are maybe going to preach this Sunday, I think that Vicar Taylor gave you a lot of materials there to work with. And if you're not, and you weren't planning on going to church, well, look, you got a mini sermon anyways. We hope you've enjoyed your time with us. But
yes.
Thank you, Taylor, for coming over to my living room for this nice conversation.
Oh, thanks for having me.
These are my wedding photos in the background.
They're beautiful.
Isn't that great there?
Built-in decor.
Yeah.
Absolutely love it. Always matches.
Well, I always find it fun whenever I get to do this in person with people rather than on the computer, so...
Yeah, I was glad it worked out that way too.
Me too. Okay. Well, that's it for this week, and thanks for joining us. Look for us next Tuesday. I always say that. It's look for me and someone else next Tuesday on Should They Don't Tell You on Sunday. And you can follow us at facebook.com/Should They Don't Tell You on Sunday, and subscribe wherever it is that you listen to podcasts. So that you can stay up to date with new episodes and hear some new stories from our new guests. And as always, share this with friends and family that you think would like to journey from us or could just use maybe a fresh perspective on some things. All right, take care. Bye.